By October 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy had already become something larger than a private citizen. To millions of Americans, she was still the widow of a fallen president, the elegant keeper of Camelot, the woman expected to carry grief with perfect restraint. Then, on a guarded Greek island, she made a choice that seemed to shatter that image. At 39, Jackie married Aristotle Onassis, a 62-year-old shipping magnate whose name evoked immense wealth, power, and controversy. The question came almost immediately. Was she marrying for love, for safety, for money, or for something more complicated? Perhaps both of them understood exactly what the other could offer. And perhaps that was the part the public found hardest to accept. To understand why Onassis could become an answer at all, the story has to return to 1963. In August of that year, Jackie gave birth prematurely to a son, Patrick. He lived for only 2 days. The loss came while she was still First Lady, still surrounded by staff, schedules, cameras, and the obligations of public life. Grief did not arrive in private. It arrived under observation. Only months later, on November 22, 1963, Jackie was sitting beside President John F. Kennedy in Dallas when he was shot. Within hours, she was no longer simply the First Lady. She had become the widow of an assassinated president, and one of the most intimate horrors of her life had become a permanent image in American history. The country saw extraordinary composure. Jackie had to live with everything that came after it. She was also raising Caroline and John Jr. inside a family name that had become inseparable from power, fascination, and danger. Public attention did not end with the funeral. Photographers remained interested in where she went, what she wore, whom she saw, and how she was rebuilding her life. Privacy was no longer something she could assume. It had to be created, defended, and sometimes purchased. Aristotle Onassis had entered the edges of that world before Jackie became a widow. In the fall of 1963, while she was still grieving Patrick, she spent time aboard his yacht, Christina, on a trip arranged through her sister, Lee Radziwill. The yacht was famous for its luxury, but luxury was only part of what it represented. Onassis had built a private world that moved across borders according to his own timetable. He had ships, staff, residences, influence, and the ability to control who came close. There was also Lee. For years, Lee and Onassis had been linked by rumor and by the social world they shared. Later accounts would turn the situation into a neat triangle. Lee loved him, Jackie took him, and the sisters never fully recovered. The reality was almost certainly messier. What matters here is that Onassis was not a stranger who suddenly appeared in Jackie's life after Robert Kennedy's death. He was already known to her, already part of the same orbit, and already associated with a kind of freedom unavailable in Washington. After JFK's assassination, Jackie did not move directly toward Onassis. She became close to architect John Carl Warneck, who had worked on President Kennedy's gravesite at Arlington. Marriage was reportedly discussed, but companionship alone did not solve the larger problems surrounding her life. By the late 1960s, Jackie was not simply choosing between men. She was deciding what kind of environment she wanted around herself and her children. Then another assassination made the fear feel immediate again. Robert F. Kennedy was shot on June 5, 1968, and died the following day. For Jackie, The killing of her brother-in-law reinforced something she had reason to fear. The Kennedy name could still attract danger as well as admiration. It also intensified an already powerful concern for Caroline and John Jr., sharpening the question of how exposed their lives had become. That is where Onassis looked different. His money could create distance. It could place water between a family and a crowd, guards between children and photographers, private property between a widow and the public appetite surrounding her. That does not mean wealth was beside the point. It means wealth and safety were connected. By the summer of 1968, Onassis represented more than romance. He offered options. For a woman whose adult life had been repeatedly transformed by events she could not control, options had become a form of power. On October 20th, 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis on Scorpios, his private island in the Ionian Sea. She was 39. He was 62. The ceremony was deliberately small and protected, almost the opposite of the public pageantry that had surrounded so much of Jackie's life. Yet the quiet ceremony produced an enormous reaction. For years, Americans had watched Jackie perform an almost impossible role. She was expected to carry elegance without seeming vain, grief without ever collapsing, and loyalty without a single complaint. After Dallas, many people stopped thinking of her as a woman whose life could continue in unpredictable directions. She had become part of the national memory of John Kennedy. In that memory, she was supposed to remain beside him forever. Marrying Onassis broke the image. He was not an American politician, nor a figure associated with Camelot. He was a Greek shipping tycoon known for aggressive business, immense wealth, private excess, and a complicated romantic reputation. To critics, the contrast seemed almost offensive. The widow of JFK was becoming Mrs. Onassis, and newspapers treated the new name as though it erased the old one. Some accused Jackie of choosing money over loyalty. Others framed the marriage as an abandonment of America. Her remarriage also ended the Secret Service protection she had received as the widow of a president. Onassis could provide a different kind of security through private guards, restricted properties, controlled travel, and staff. It would be an exaggeration to claim his system was simply stronger. What mattered was that it belonged to a private world he controlled. Religion added another layer. Rumors spread that Jackie might be excommunicated from the Catholic Church because Onassis had been married before. The situation was more complicated than the headline suggested, and Cardinal Richard Cushing publicly rejected claims that Jackie had simply been cast out of the church. But the controversy reinforced the idea that her marriage had crossed more than one boundary. Jackie did not offer the public a long defense. That silence became part of the mystery. Admirers saw independence. Critics saw calculation. Some believed a frightened mother had found the one man rich enough to protect her children. Others believed the word protection was simply a polite way of saying money. Then came the contradiction that makes the story more interesting. Jackie did not disappear from America. New York remained central to her life, and her Fifth Avenue apartment had been purchased years before the marriage. Her children remained connected to the United States. She returned often, sometimes without Onassis. So if the marriage was an escape, it was not a complete escape. Jackie was not trading one identity for another. She was trying to build a life in which several identities could coexist. Safety mattered, and so did money. And so, in a quieter way, did freedom. The marriage would reveal how difficult it was to separate one from the others. The anger also exposed a strange form of public ownership. Many Americans had embraced Jackie because she seemed to carry their grief with them. But that affection came with expectations about how she should behave, whom she should love, and how long she should remain attached to the role history had assigned her. Her second marriage forced a question few people wanted to ask. Did the nation admire Jackie as a person? Or did it admire the version of Jackie that preserved its preferred memory of JFK? From the outside, Jackie and Onassis seemed almost absurdly mismatched. She represented polished American society, cultural refinement, and a style of public restraint that had become famous around the world. He represented entrepreneurial force, international shipping, risk, appetite, and enormous personal authority. Yet those differences may help explain why the relationship made sense. Onassis possessed things Jackie could not easily create for herself. His fortune allowed him to control space. Scorpios was not merely an expensive island. It was territory where access could be limited. His yacht could move across borders without exposing its passengers to ordinary travel. His homes, employees, and security arrangements created layers between Jackie and a press corps that had spent years pursuing her. For Caroline and John Jr., that kind of privacy had obvious value. For Jackie, so did financial independence. Pretending otherwise makes the story less honest, not more sympathetic. She had spent years in environments of extraordinary wealth and understood what money could do. Money could not bring Patrick back, undo Dallas, or guarantee her happiness. But it could buy choices. And after years in which so much of her life had been determined by events beyond her control, choices had enormous value. Onassis also gained something difficult to price. Money had taken him nearly everywhere. But Jackie possessed a form of status that could not simply be ordered from a shipyard or purchased with another estate. She carried the aura of the Kennedy White House. She moved naturally in cultural and political circles. She had become one of the most recognizable women in the world without building that recognition around wealth alone. Beside Jackie, Onassis looked different. Her presence softened the rougher edges of his image. She brought cultural prestige, social legitimacy, and proximity to an American political mythology more powerful than ordinary celebrity. Her presence could open social and cultural doors that money alone did not automatically unlock. That is why describing the marriage only as a rescue misses half the story. Onassis was useful to Jackie. Jackie was useful to Onassis. Some observers have put it more harshly. They used each other. But adult relationships can contain affection and advantage at the same time. A marriage can be emotionally real while also being strategic. The fact that both people benefited does not prove that neither cared. It may simply mean they entered the relationship with fewer illusions than the public wanted to imagine. The material world around them made that bargain visible. Scorpios became a symbol of protection made physical. The island had villas, beaches, staff, and controlled access. But its most important feature for Jackie may have been separation. People could not simply appear there. Photographers could not follow in the same way they could on a Manhattan sidewalk. Christina, the yacht, represented something similar. Its interiors were famous, and the vessel hosted royalty, politicians, celebrities, and business figures. Yet for Jackie, Its deeper value was mobility without surrendering privacy. She could leave one country and arrive in another while remaining inside a controlled environment. Still, Jackie never fully dissolved into Onassis's world. New York remained hers. Her Fifth Avenue home had been acquired before the marriage, and that fact matters because it corrects the image of a woman who abandoned America and then returned only after Onassis died. She kept a foothold in both worlds from the beginning. This is where money and security stop being competing explanations. Onassis's wealth was the mechanism that produced many of the conditions Jackie wanted: controlled access, mobility, private space, and the ability to withdraw without becoming inaccessible to the people she chose. So the question was never simply whether she married for money or for safety. The harder part was what she believed that money could protect her from, and what she already knew it never could. The age difference intensified the public suspicion. Jackie was 39. Onassis was 62. Critics used that gap to tell opposing stories. Either she was vulnerable and dependent, or she was trading youth for wealth. Both interpretations flatten her into a role. By 1968, Jackie had already navigated world leaders, political dynasties, betrayal, grief, and intense public scrutiny. Whatever she was doing, she was not entering the marriage without experience. For a time, the arrangement seemed to work. Jackie could move through a world of extraordinary luxury while keeping much of her family life behind closed gates. On Scorpios, Caroline and John Jr. had space that was difficult to find in the United States. Their movements could be protected from the press. Their mother could decide who entered the environment around them. Motherhood was central to Jackie's decisions, but it should not be used as a blanket explanation for everything she did. She was not only a mother, she was also a woman with social ambition, aesthetic judgment, expensive tastes, intellectual interests, financial concerns, and a strong need for autonomy. Reducing every choice to the children is almost as simplistic as reducing every choice to money. The marriage itself settled into a rhythm that was less romantic than the photograph suggested. Onassis lived according to the demands of his business empire. Ships, negotiations, disputes, investments, and travel continued to dominate his schedule. Jackie had entered his world, but she did not become its single center of gravity. Her own priorities were different. She cared about the children's education, culture, books, history, and maintaining a sense of continuity with her American life. The two of them could appear together as one of the most famous couples on Earth, while privately living in patterns that often ran beside each other rather than fully together. That distance matters. It also helps explain why Maria Callas cannot be treated as a minor footnote. Long before Jackie married Onassis, the Greek shipping magnate had been closely associated with the celebrated opera singer. Their relationship had been famous, emotionally intense, and deeply entangled with his public reputation. Marriage to Jackie did not erase Callas from the story. Reports and rumors about Onassis's continuing attachment to Callas persisted after the wedding. The exact boundaries of that relationship are not always easy to establish, and there is no reason to turn rumor into certainty. But Callas remained part of the emotional landscape around Onassis, and Jackie would have had little reason to imagine otherwise. She was not naive. At 39, Jackie had already been First Lady, lived among presidents and billionaires, survived betrayal in her first marriage, endured public tragedy, and spent years inside elite social circles. She knew Onassis's reputation, knew who Maria Callas was, and knew that the man she was marrying lived by rules very different from conventional domestic life. That makes the marriage more interesting, not less. It is less useful to ask how Jackie could have failed to see what Onassis was. The better question is what made the bargain worth accepting, even though she saw it clearly. Privacy was part of the answer, and so were wealth and independence. There may also have been affection, attraction, companionship, and the strange comfort of being with someone powerful enough not to be intimidated by her fame. But none of those things could guarantee intimacy. Onassis's absences continued. His business world demanded attention. Jackie spent substantial time in New York. The relationship between husband and wife could be warm in one period and distant in another. From outside, the yachts and island beaches suggested a permanent vacation. Inside, the structure of the marriage left room for loneliness. Scorpios captures that contradiction well. At first, the island looks like freedom. Crowds can't reach it. Cameras can't get close, and no fixed schedule dictates her days. But an island is also defined by separation. The same water that keeps intruders away can remind the people inside how far they are from ordinary life. Christina carried the same double meaning. It was a sanctuary that moved. It was also a floating world in which the rules belonged to Onassis. Jackie had solved one problem. She was less exposed, but she had not solved grief or trust or the emotional consequences of living with a man who remained tied to an empire, a complicated romantic past, and his own appetite for control. Money could buy nearly every form of privacy available in the 20th century. It could not buy closeness on demand. And then, in 1973, the balance of the marriage changed completely. The man Jackie had once viewed as a source of protection encountered a loss that no island, yacht, fortune, or influence could keep away. There was also the reality that Jackie was entering an established family, not simply marrying a self-contained man. Christina Onassis remained part of that world, and the marriage linked two complicated family systems whose loyalties had formed long before Jackie arrived. That tension would matter more later, when grief and inheritance forced private relationships into legal negotiations. Aristotle Onassis's son, Alexander, was 24 when he died following a plane crash in 1973. For a man who had built his identity around command, expansion, and the ability to bend circumstances toward his will, the loss was devastating. Alexander was not only his child, he represented succession, continuity, and the future of the Onassis name. Suddenly, that future was gone. The effect on Aristotle was visible. His energy declined, and grief altered the way he moved through the world. A businessman known for dominating rooms and driving negotiations at a relentless pace became increasingly withdrawn. Wealth could not disguise the change. For Jackie, there was a terrible familiarity in watching it happen. She knew what sudden death could do to a family. She knew, too, how a life could be divided into before and after by a hospital room, a gunshot, a phone call, or an accident, and that enormous resources did not make grief negotiable. The roles inside the marriage began to reverse. In 1968, Jackie had looked toward Onassis as a man whose money and private world could create protection around her family. After Alexander's death, Onassis himself became vulnerable. The protector was no longer untouchable. His health deteriorated as well. Onassis suffered from myasthenia gravis, a serious neuromuscular illness that can cause profound weakness and interfere with breathing. For someone whose sense of self had been built around stamina and control, physical decline brought another kind of humiliation. Business remained important, even when his body made the old pace increasingly difficult. The marriage, already marked by stretches of separation, grew more distant. Onassis was grieving his son and facing his own mortality. Jackie remained connected to him while also maintaining a life that increasingly drew her back toward New York. Their worlds had long run in parallel. Now the distance between those tracks widened. And as his condition worsened, the subject that had haunted the marriage from the beginning moved into the foreground: money. Critics had talked about it from the moment the wedding was announced. Admirers had sometimes minimized it by insisting Jackie wanted only safety. But now Onassis was seriously ill. His empire was enormous. His daughter Christina stood at the center of the family inheritance, and practical questions could no longer be avoided. The simplest version says, Greek law prevented Jackie, as a non-Greek wife, from inheriting Onassis's fortune. That is too crude. Her eventual position was shaped by Greek inheritance rules. Onassis's will, financial arrangements connected to the marriage, and negotiations involving his family. Christina was central to the estate, and whatever personal tensions may have existed, money created legal questions that grief alone could not resolve. This is where the saint versus gold digger argument becomes especially weak. Financial independence mattered to Jackie. Money determined where she could live, how she could protect her privacy, what choices were available to her, and how dependent she would remain on another family after her husband's death. But if money were the only thing that mattered, another question appears. Why did Jackie ultimately separate herself from the Onassis empire instead of trying to spend the rest of her life controlling it? On March 15, 1975, Aristotle Onassis died in Paris. Jackie was a widow again, but almost nothing about this widowhood resembled 1963. There was no murdered American president, no nation standing still, no White House transformed into a stage of mourning. This death belonged to a smaller and more private world. After it came lawyers, negotiations, and the practical work of closing a complicated marriage. Jackie and Christina Onassis eventually reached a settlement, generally reported at roughly $26 million in total, though accounts differ in how they describe the components of that figure. The number became evidence for whichever version of Jackie people already preferred. Critics saw confirmation that wealth had been central. Defenders saw a normal financial conclusion to a marriage involving one of the richest men in the world. But a settlement in 1975 cannot tell us exactly what Jackie felt in 1968. It cannot prove that fear was false, that love was pure, or that money was the sole motive. What it shows is simpler. This marriage had an economic structure as well as an emotional one. There was also something revealing in what Jackie did next. Once the financial questions were settled, she stepped away from the Onassis world and increasingly centered her life in the United States. The chapter that had opened on Scorpios ended not with a dramatic confession, but with distance. Then she left. That departure matters because it prevents the estate from becoming the final definition of the marriage. Jackie did not emerge from the Onassis years untouched, And she did not leave empty-handed. She left with substantial financial security, but also with another set of losses behind her and a clearer sense that protection purchased from another person's power could never be the same as control over her own life. The next chapter would be less spectacular, but in some ways more revealing. New York became the center of the life that followed, though it is misleading to say Jackie simply returned to America after years of absence. She had never completely left. Her Fifth Avenue apartment, her family connections, her children's lives, and her own habits had kept New York present throughout the Onassis marriage. What changed after 1975 was not geography alone. It was emphasis. Without Onassis, Jackie could build a routine that belonged more clearly to her. Publishing became one of the most important parts of that transformation. She joined Viking Press as a consulting editor, entering a profession that offered almost the opposite of the public roles that had defined her. An editor can shape a project without becoming its face. The work requires judgment, patience, taste, and influence that often remains invisible. That suited Jackie. Her time at Viking ended after controversy surrounding a novel involving a fictional political assassination. Given her history, the association produced intense criticism, and she resigned. But she did not abandon publishing. She later joined Doubleday, where editorial work became a much more durable part of her life. She gravitated toward books involving history, culture, art, biography, and ideas. The work did not erase her privilege, and it would be dishonest to present Jackie as an ordinary single mother struggling to survive on a salary. She remained extremely wealthy, socially connected, and protected by resources most working women did not have. But privilege does not make purpose meaningless. For Jackie, editing offered something her money could not automatically provide: a role attached to her own judgment rather than to a husband. As First Lady, she had been part of a political institution. As Mrs. Onassis, she had lived inside a billionaire's international world. In publishing, her contribution could be quieter and more personal. Historic preservation offered another expression of the same impulse. Jackie had shown an interest in architecture and cultural memory long before Onassis. In New York, she became associated with efforts to protect Grand Central Terminal and other threatened spaces. The cause allowed her public influence to serve something other than curiosity about her private life. The distinction matters. Jackie did not become anonymous after 1975. She remained famous. But fame no longer had to be the occupation itself. She could choose when to use it. She could work without pretending to need the paycheck, support preservation without running for office, and maintain her Kennedy family ties without returning to Washington as a permanent political widow. She could live with extraordinary privilege while still insisting it did not define the full range of her interests. Caroline and John Jr. remained central, but motherhood no longer needs to explain every decision. Jackie was a mother and an editor. She cared about her children and about beauty, books, buildings, friendship, money, privacy, and independence. Those motives could coexist. That is one of the clearest lessons of the years after Onassis. For much of her adult life, other people had tried to compress Jackie into a single role. First Lady, widow, national symbol, billionaire's wife. New York gave her room to be less easily summarized. The quieter rhythm also changed the emotional temperature of her story. For years, nearly every major chapter had been defined by someone else's office, fortune, death, or family name. Editorial work did not erase those histories, but it gave her days a structure that was not built around crisis. There were manuscripts to read, meetings to attend, authors to guide, and projects that could succeed or fail without becoming a referendum on Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. That ordinariness was relative, of course. Nothing about Jackie's social or financial position was ordinary. Yet the ability to choose a quieter form of importance was itself part of the independence she had been seeking for years. Her later years also challenge another misleading image: that after Aristotle Onassis, Jackie spent the rest of her life alone, permanently suspended between the memories of two famous husbands. She did not. Morris Templesman became an important longtime companion in the later part of her life. His presence matters here not because it opens another grand romantic chapter, but because it reveals how incomplete the public labels remained. Jackie Kennedy, Jackie Onassis, presidential widow, shipping magnate's wife. None of those names captured the entirety of the woman living behind them. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the intensity surrounding Jackie had diminished. She continued working, maintained close relationships, spent time with family, and lived more privately than during the years when nearly every major decision could become international news. The distance she had once tried to create through islands, yachts, and guards now came from something simpler: greater control over access. Then, near the end of 1993, Jackie was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Treatment followed, but the illness progressed quickly. She withdrew from public life as her health declined and remained close to family and the people she trusted. It is tempting, especially in stories about famous women, to turn final illness into one last performance of character. Later retellings sometimes describe Jackie's inner calm with more certainty than the evidence allows. There is no need to claim exactly how fearless or accepting she felt. What we know is enough. Her life had already been repeatedly exposed to public interpretation, from Dallas to Scorpios to the Onassis estate. In her final months, the circle around her became smaller. On May 19, 1994, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in New York at the age of 64. By then, the argument over who she had really been was decades old. It still is. Templesman's importance also complicates the idea that Jackie's deepest attachments could be understood only through marriage. Their relationship belonged to a later, quieter stage of her life and did not carry the same public mythology as JFK or the same spectacle as Onassis. That may be precisely why it is so revealing. By then, companionship no longer had to arrive with a presidency, a private island, or a global business empire. Her children were adults. Her professional identity was established, and the public appetite around her had softened. Fame had not gone away, and neither had her wealth or the sense that people were watching. But now she had more control over how much of herself remained available for interpretation. To some people, Jackie remains almost sacred. The graceful First Lady who survived unimaginable loss and protected her children while the world refused to leave her alone. To others, that image is too polished. They see privilege, luxury, calculation, and a woman willing to marry extraordinary wealth. Both versions contain fragments of truth. Neither is enough. Did Jackie marry Aristotle Onassis for security? The circumstances of 1968 make security impossible to dismiss. Patrick was dead. JFK had been assassinated beside her, and Robert Kennedy had been murdered, while Caroline and John Jr. were growing up under relentless attention. Onassis could offer barriers, mobility, controlled access, and private space on a scale few people could match. Did money matter? Of course it did. His fortune financed the island, the yacht, the staff, the residences, the travel, and the independence Jackie found useful. Calling that security instead of money creates a false distinction. Money was part of the security, but that does not make Jackie nothing more than a gold digger. She entered the marriage as one of the most famous women in the world and brought Onassis something he valued too: prestige, social access, cultural legitimacy, and proximity to the Kennedy name. The exchange went both ways. That is what makes the Onassis years more interesting than the fairy tale, and more complicated than the indictment. Jackie was not a helpless doll carried away by a billionaire, not a saint untouched by money, and not simply a schemer who married an older man for a fortune. The marriage gave her privacy, distance, resources, and protection. It also brought isolation, emotional distance, the shadow of Maria Callas, Alexander's death, Onassis's decline, and another widowhood. Afterward, Jackie kept moving. She worked, edited, supported preservation, remained a mother, built another long companionship, and resisted being permanently trapped inside either of her most famous names. America had wanted Jacqueline Kennedy to remain the widow of Camelot. Later, the tabloids wanted Jacqueline Onassis to become the woman who chose a billionaire. The real double life was the distance between the woman the world needed Jackie to be and the life she was willing to choose for herself.